We are on chapter 11 of C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle. It's called The Pace Quickens, and I'm Terry, Bible Knight, your reader. Quick as lightning, Rishta Tarkan leaped back out of reach of the king's sword. He was no coward and would have fought single-handed against Tirian and the dwarf if need were, but he could not take on the eagle and the unicorn as well. He knew how eagles can fly into your face and peck at your eyes and blind you with their wings. And he'd heard from his father, who had met Narnians in battle, that no man, except with arrows or a long spear, can match a unicorn, for it rears on its hind legs as it falls upon you, and then you have its hoofs and its horn and its teeth to deal with all at once. So he rushed into the crowd and stood calling out, to me, warriors of the Tisrock, may he live forever! To me, all loyal Narnians, lest the wrath of Tashland fall upon you!" While this was happening, two other things happened as well. The ape had not realized his danger as quickly as the Tarkan. For a second or so, he remained squatting beside the fire, staring at the newcomers. Then Tirian rushed upon the wretched creature, picked it up by the scruff of the neck, and dashed back to the stable, shouting, "Open the door!" Pagan opened it. "Go and drink your own medicine, shift," said Tirian, and hurled the ape through into the darkness. But as the dwarf banged the door shut again, a blinding greenish-blue light shone out from the inside of the stable. The earth shook, and there was a strange noise, a clucking and screaming, as if it was the hoarse voice of some monstrous bird. The beasts moaned and howled and called out, "Tashlan, hide us from him!" Many fell down, and many hid their faces in their wings or paws. No one except Farsight the eagle, who has the best eyes of all living things, noticed the face of Rishta Tarkan at that moment. And from what Farsight saw there, he knew at once that Rishta was just as surprised and nearly as frightened as everyone else. There goes one, thought Farsight, who called on gods he does not believe in. How will it be with him if they have really come? The third thing, which also happened at the same moment, was the only really beautiful thing that night. Every single talking dog in the whole meeting, there were 15 of them, came bounding and barking joyously to the king's side. They were mostly great big dogs with thick shoulders and heavy jaws. Their coming was like the breaking of a great wave on the sea beach. It nearly knocked you down. For though they were talking dogs, they were just as doggy as they could be, and they all stood up and put their front paws on the shoulders of the humans and licked their faces, all saying at once, "Welcome, welcome, we'll help, help. Show us how to help. Show us how. It was so lovely that it made you want to cry. This at last was the sort of thing they'd been hoping for. And when a moment later several little animals, mice and moles and a squirrel or so, came pattering up, squealing with joy and saying, see, we're here," and when after that the bear and the boar came too, Eustace began to feel that perhaps, after all, everything might be going to come right. But Tirian gazed round and saw how very few of the animals had moved. To me, he called. "Have you all turned cowards since I was your king?" "We daren't," whimpered dozens of voices. "Tashlan would be angry. Shield us from Tashlan." "Where are all the talking horses?" asked Tirian. We've seen, squealed the mice. "The ape has made them work. They're all tied, down at the bottom of the hill." "Then all you little ones," said Tirian, "you nibblers and gnawers and nutcrackers, away with you as fast as you can scamper and see if the horses are on our side. And if they are, get your teeth into the ropes and gnaw till the horses are free and bring them hither." "With a good will, sire," came the small voices, and with a whisk of tails those sharp-eyed and sharp-toothed folk were off. Tirian smiled for mere love as he saw them go. But it was already time to be thinking of other things. Rishta Tarkan was giving his orders. "Forward," the Tarkan said. "Take all of them alive if you can and hurl them into the stable, or drive them into it. When they're all in, we will put fire to it and make them an offering to the great god Tash." "Ha," said Farsight to himself. "So that is how he hopes to win Tash's pardon for his unbelief." The enemy line, about half of Rishta's force, was now moving forward, and Tirian had barely time to give his orders. "Out on the left, Jill. Try to shoot all you may before they reach us. Boar and bear next to her. Pagan on my left, Eustace on my right. Hold the right wing, Jewel. Stand by him, Puzzle, and use your hoofs. Hover and strike, Farsight. You dogs, just behind us. Go in among them after the sword play has begun. Aslan to our aid." Eustace stood with his heart beating terribly, hoping and hoping that he would be brave. He'd never seen anything, though he had seen both a dragon and a sea serpent, that made his blood run so cold as that line of dark-faced, bright-eyed men. There were 15 Calormenes, a talking bull of Narnia, Slinky the fox, and Raggle the satyr. Then he heard twang and zip on his left, and one Calormene fell. Then twang and zip again, and the satyr was down. "Oh, well done, daughter," came Tirian's voice, and then the enemy were upon them. Eustace could never remember what happened in the next 2 minutes. It was all like a dream, the sort you have when your temperature is over 100, until he heard Rishta-Tarkan's voice calling out from the distance, "Retire! Back hither and reform!" Then Eustace came to his senses and saw the Calormenes scampering back to their friends, but not all of them. 2 lay dead, pierced by Jewel's horn, one by Tirian's sword. The fox lay dead at his own feet, and he wondered if it was he who had killed it. The bull also was down, shot through the eye by an arrow from Jill and gashed in his side by the boar's tusk. But our side had its losses too. 3 dogs were killed, and a 4th was hobbling behind the line on 3 legs and whimpering. The bear lay on the ground, moving feebly. Then it mumbled in its throaty voice, bewildered to the last, "I don't understand." He laid his big head down on the grass as quietly as a child going to sleep and never moved again. In fact, the first attack had failed. Eustace didn't seem to be able to be glad about it. He was so terribly thirsty, and his arm ached so. As the defeated Calormenes went back to their commander, the dwarfs began jeering at them. "Had enough?" they yelled. "Don't you like it? Why don't you get your great Tarkan to go and fight himself instead of sending you to be killed?" "Dwarfs," cried Tirian, "come here and use your swords, not your tongues. There's still time. Dwarfs of Narnia, you can fight well, I know. Come back to your allegiance." "Ah," sneered the dwarfs, "not likely. You're just as big humbugs as the other lot. We don't want any kings. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." Boo! Then the drum began. Not a dwarf drum this time, but a big bull's hide Calormene drum. The children from the very first hated the sound. Boom, boom, ba-ba, boom, it went. But they would have hated it far worse if they'd known what it meant. Tirian did. It meant there were other Calormene troops somewhere near, and Rishta-Tarkan was calling them to his aid. Tirian and Jewel looked at one another sadly. They had just begun to hope that they might win that night, but it would be all over with them if new enemies appeared. Tirian gazed despairingly round. Several Narnians were standing with the Calormenes, whether through treachery or in honest fear of Tashlan. Others were sitting still, staring, not likely to join either side. But there were fewer animals now. The crowd was much smaller. Clearly, several had just crept quietly away during the fighting. Boom, boom, ba-ba, boom, went the horrible drum. And then another sound began to mix with it. "Listen," said Jewel. "And then look," said Farsight. A moment later there was no doubting what it was. With a thunder of hoofs, with tossing heads, widened nostrils, and waving manes, over a score of talking horses of Narnia came charging up the hill. The gnawers and nibblers had done their work. Poggin the dwarf and the children opened their mouths to cheer, but that cheer never came. Suddenly the air was full of the sound of twanging bowstrings and hissing arrows. It was the dwarfs who were shooting, and for a moment Jill could hardly believe her eyes. They were shooting the horses. Dwarfs are deadly archers. Horse after horse rolled over. Not one of those noble beasts ever reached the king. "Little swine!" shrieked Eustace, dancing in his rage. "Dirty, filthy, treacherous little brutes!" Even Jewel said, "Shall I run after those dwarfs, sire, and spit 10 of them on my horn at each plunge?" But Tirian, with his face as stern as stone, said, "Stand fast, Jewel. If you must weep, sweetheart," this was to Jill, "turn your face aside and see you wet not your bowstring. And peace, Eustace. Do not scold like a kitchen maid. No warrior scolds. Courteous words or hard knocks are the only language." But the dwarfs cheered back at Eustace. "That was a surprise for you, little boy, eh? You thought we were on your side, did you? No fear. We don't want any talking horses. We don't want you to win any more than the other gang. You can't take us in. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." Rishta-Tarkan was still talking to his men, doubtless making arrangements for the next attack and probably wishing he had sent his whole force into the fray. The drum boomed on, and then, to their horror, Tirian and his friends heard, far fainter, as if from a long way off, an answering drum. Another body of Calormenes had heard Eustace's signal and were coming to support him. You would not have known from Tirian's face that he had now given up all hope. "Listen," he whispered in a matter-of-fact voice, "we must attack now, before yonder miscreants are strengthened by their friends." "Bethink you, sire," said Poggin, "that here we have the good wooden wall of the stable at our backs. If we advance, shall we not be encircled, and get sword points between our shoulders?" "I would say as you do, dwarf," said Tirian, "were it not their very plan to force us into the stable. The further we are from its deadly door, the better." "The king is right," said Farsight. "Away from this accursed stable and whatever goblin lives inside it, at all costs." "Yes, let's," said Eustace. "I'm coming to hate the very sight of it." "Good," said Tirian. "Now look yonder to our left. You see a great rock that gleams white like marble in the firelight. First we will fall upon those Calormenes. You, maiden, shall move out on our left and shoot as fast as ever you may into their ranks, and you, Eagle, fly at their faces from the right. Meanwhile, we others will be charging them. When we are so close, Jill, that you can no longer shoot at them for fear of striking us, go back to the white rock and wait. You others, keep your ears wide, even in the fighting. We must put them to flight in a few minutes or else not at all, for we are fewer than they. As soon as I call back, then rush to join Jill at the white rock, where we shall have protection behind us and can breathe a while. Now, be off, Jill." Feeling terribly alone, Jill ran out about 20 feet, put her right leg back and her left leg forward, and set an arrow to her string. She wished her hands were not shaking so. "That's a rotten shot," she said to herself as her first arrow sped toward the enemy and flew over their heads. But she had another on the string the next moment. She knew speed was what mattered. She saw something big and black darting into the faces of the Calormenes. That was Farsight. First one man and then another dropped his sword and put up both his hands to defend his eyes. Then one of her own arrows hit a man, and another hit a Narnian wolf, who had, it seemed, joined the enemy. But she'd been shooting only for a few seconds when she had to stop. With a flash of swords and of the boar's tusks and Jewel's horn, and with deep baying from the dogs, Tirian and his party were rushing on their enemies like men in a 100-yard race. Jill was astonished to see how unprepared the Calormenes seemed to be. She did not realize that this was the result of her work and the Eagle's. Very few troops can keep on looking steadily to the front if they're getting arrows in their faces from one side and being pecked by an eagle on the other. "Oh, well done! Well done!" shouted Jill. The king's party were cutting their way right into the enemy. The unicorn was tossing men as you'd toss hay on a fork. Even Eustace seemed to Jill, who, after all, didn't know very much about swordsmanship, to be fighting brilliantly. The dogs were at the Calormenes' throats. It was going to work. It was victory at last. With a horrible cold shock, Jill noticed a strange thing. Though Calormenes were falling at each Narnian sword stroke, they never seemed to get any fewer. In fact, there were actually more of them now than when the fight began. There were more every second. They were running up from every side. They were new Calormenes. These ones had spears. There was such a crowd of them that she could hardly see her own friends. And then she heard Tirian's voice crying, "Back! To the rock!" The enemy had been reinforced. The drum had done its work. And that's the end of Chapter 11. We are on Chapter 12 of C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, and it's called Through the Stable Door. Jill ought to have been back at the White Rock already, but she'd quite forgotten that part of her orders in the excitement of watching the fight. Now she remembered. She returned at once and ran to it and arrived there barely a second before the others. It thus happened that all of them for a moment had their backs to the enemy. They all wheeled round the moment they had reached it. A terrible sight met their eyes. A Calormene was running toward the stable door carrying something that kicked and struggled. As he came between them and the fire, they could see clearly both the shape of the man and the shape of what he carried. It was Eustace. Tirian and the unicorn rushed out to rescue him, but the Calormene was now far nearer to the door than they. Before they'd covered half the distance, he'd flung Eustace in and shut the door on him. Half a dozen more Calormenes had run up behind him. They formed lines on the open space before the stable. There was no getting at it now. Even then, Jill remembered to keep her face turned aside, well away from her bow. "Even if I can't stop blubbing, I won't get my string wet," she said. "Wear arrows," said Poggin suddenly. Everyone ducked and pulled his helmet well over his nose. The dogs crouched behind. But though a few arrows came their way, it soon became clear they were not being shot at. Griffel and his dwarfs were at their archery again. This time they were coolly shooting at the Calormenes. "Keep it up, boys," came Griffel's voice. "All together. Carefully. We don't want them any more than we want monkeys or lions or kings. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. Whatever else you may say about dwarfs, no one can say they aren't brave. They could easily have got away to some safe place. They preferred to stay and kill as many of both sides as they could, except when both sides were kind enough to save them trouble by killing one another. They wanted Narnia for their own." What perhaps they had not taken into account was that the Calormenes were mail-clad and the horses had had no protection. Also, the Calormenes had a leader. Rishta Tarkan's voice cried out, "30 of you keep watch on those fools by the White Rock. The rest after me, that we may teach these sons of Earth a lesson." Tirian and his friends, still panting from their fight and thankful for a few minutes' rest, stood and looked on while the Tarkan led his men against the dwarfs. It was a strange scene by now. The fire had sunk lower. The light it gave was now less of a darker red. As far as one could see, the whole place of assembly was now empty except for the dwarfs and the Calormenes. In that light, one couldn't make out much of what was happening. It sounded as if the dwarfs were putting up a good fight. Tirian could hear Griffel using dreadful language, and every now and then the Tarkan calling, "Take all you can alive! Take them alive!" Whatever that fight may have been like, it did not last long. The noises of it died away. Then Jill saw the Tarkan coming back to the stable. 11 men followed him, dragging 11 bound dwarfs. Whether the others had all been killed or whether some of them had got away was never known. "Throw them into the shrine of Tash," said Rishta Tarkan. And when the 11 dwarfs, one after the other, had been flung or kicked into that dark doorway, and the door had been shut again, he bowed low to the stable and said, "These also are for thy burnt offering, Lord Tash." And all the Calormenes banged the flats of their swords on their shields and shouted, "Tash, Tash, the great god Tash, inexorable Tash." There was no nonsense about Tashland now. The little party by the White Rock watched these doings and whispered to one another. They had found a trickle of water coming down the rock, and all had drunk eagerly, Jill and Poggin and the king in their hands, while the 4-footed ones leapt from the little pool which it had made at the foot of the stone. Such was their thirst that it seemed the most delicious drink they'd ever had in their lives, and while they were drinking they were perfectly happy and could not think of anything else. "I feel in my bones," said Poggin, "that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. I can think of 100 deaths I would rather have died." "It is indeed a grim door," said Tirian. "It is more like a mouth." "Oh, can't we do anything to stop it?" said Jill in a shaken voice. "Nay, fair friend," said Jewel, nosing her gently. "It may be for us the door to Aslan's country, and we shall sup at his table tonight." Rishta Tarkan turned his back on the stable and walked slowly to a place in front of the White Rock. "Hearken," he said, "if the boar and the dogs and the unicorn will come over to me and put themselves in my mercy, their lives shall be spared. The boar shall go to a cage in the Tisrog's garden, the dogs to the Tisrog's kennels, and the unicorn, when I have sawn his horn off, shall draw a cart. But the eagle, the children, and he who was the king shall be offered to Tash this night." The only answer was growls. "Get on, warriors," said the Tarkan. "Kill the beasts, but take the 2-legged ones alive." And then the last battle of the last king of Narnia began. What made it hopeless, even apart from the numbers of the enemy, was the spears. The Calormenes, who had been with the ape almost from the beginning, had had no spears. That was because they'd come into Narnia by 1s and 2s, pretending to be peaceful merchants. And of course they'd carried no spears, for a spear is not a thing you can hide. The new ones must have come in later, after the ape was already strong and they could march openly. The spears made all the difference. With a long spear you can kill a boar before you are in reach of his tusks, and a unicorn before you are in reach of his horn, if you are very quick and keep your head. And now the leveled spears were closing in on Tirian and his last friends. Next minute, they were all fighting for their lives. In a way, it wasn't quite so bad as you might think. When you're using every muscle to the full, ducking under a spear point here, leaping over it there, lunging forward, drawing back, wheeling round, you haven't much time to feel either frightened or sad. Tirian knew he could do nothing for the others now. They were all doomed together. He vaguely saw the boar go down on one side of him and Jewel fighting furiously on the other. Out of the corner of one eye he saw, but only just saw, a big Calormene pulling Jill away somewhere by her hair. But he hardly thought about any of these things. His only thought now was to sell his life as dearly as he could. The worst of it was that he couldn't keep up the position in which he'd started, under the White Rock. A man who is fighting a dozen enemies at once must take his chances wherever he can, must dart in wherever he sees an enemy's breast or neck unguarded. In a very few strokes, this may get you quite a distance from the spot where you began. Tirian soon found that he was getting further and further to the right, nearer to the stable. He had a vague idea in his mind that there was some good reason for keeping away from it, but he couldn't now remember what the reason was, and anyway, he couldn't help it. All at once, everything came quite clear. He found he was fighting the Tarkan himself. The bonfire, what was left of it, was straight in front. He was, in fact, in the very doorway of the stable, for it had been opened, and 2 Calormenes were holding the door, ready to slam it shut the minute he was inside. He remembered everything now, and he realized the enemy had been edging him to the stable on purpose ever since the fight began. And while he was thinking this, he was still fighting the Tarkan as hard as he could. A new idea came into Tirian's head. He dropped his sword, darted forward, in under the sweep of the Tarkan scimitar, and seized his enemy by the belt with both hands, and jumped back into the stable, shouting, "Come in and meet Tash yourself." There was a deafening noise. As when the ape had been flung in, the earth shook and there was a blinding light. The Calormene soldiers outside screamed, "Tash, Tash," and banged the door. If Tash wanted their own captain, Tash must have him. They, at any rate, did not want to meet Tash. For a moment or two, Tirian did not know where he was or even who he was. Then he steadied himself, blinked, and looked around. It was not dark inside the stable, as he had expected. He was in strong light. That was why he was blinking. He turned to look at Rishta Tarkan, but Rishta was not looking at him. Rishta gave a great wail and pointed. Then he put his hands before his face and fell flat, face downward on the ground. Tirian looked at the direction where the Tarkan had pointed, and then he understood. A terrible figure was coming towards them. It was far smaller than the shape they had seen from the tower, though still much bigger than a man, and it was the same. It had a vulture's head and 4 arms. Its beak was open and its eyes blazed. A croaking voice came from its beak. "Thou hast called me into Narnia, Rishta Tarkan. Here I am. What hast thou to say?" But the Tarkan neither lifted his face from the ground nor said a word. He was shaking like a man with a bad hiccup. He was brave enough in battle, but half his courage had left him earlier that night when he first began to suspect there might be a real Tash. The rest of it had left him now. With a sudden jerk, like a hen stooping to pick up a worm, Tash pounced on the miserable Rishta and tucked him under the upper of his 2 left arms. Then Tash turned his head sideways to fix Tirian with one of his terrible eyes. For, of course, having a bird's head, he couldn't look at you straight. But immediately, from behind Tash, strong and calm as the summer sea, a voice said, "Begone, monster, and take your lawful prey to your own place, in the name of Aslan and Aslan's great father, the Emperor oversea." The hideous creature vanished, with the Tarkan still under its arm, and Tirian turned to see who had spoken. What he saw then set his heart beating as it had never beaten in any fight. 7 kings and queens stood before him, all with crowns on their heads and all in glittering clothes, but the kings wore fine mail as well, and had their swords drawn in their hands. Tirian bowed courteously and was about to speak when the youngest of the queens laughed. He stared at her face and then gasped with amazement, for he knew her. It was Jill, but not Jill as he had last seen her, with her face all dirt and tears and an old drill dress half slipping off one shoulder. Now she looked cool and fresh as if she had just come from bathing. At first he thought she looked older, but then he didn't, and he could never make up his mind on that point. And then he saw that the youngest of the kings was Eustace, but he also was changed, as Jill was changed. Tirian suddenly felt awkward about coming among these people with the blood and dust and sweat of a battle still on him. Next moment he realized that he was not in that state at all. He was fresh and cool and clean, and dressed in such clothes as he would have worn for a great feast at Cair Paravel. But in Narnia, your good clothes were never your uncomfortable ones. They knew how to make things that felt beautiful as well as looking beautiful in Narnia, and there was no such thing as starch or flannel or elastic to be found from one end of the country to the other. "Sire," said Jill, coming forward and making a beautiful curtsy, "let me make you known to Peter the High King over all kings in Narnia." Tirian had no need to ask which was the High King, for he remembered his face, though here it was far nobler, from his dream. He stepped forward, sank on one knee, and kissed Peter's hand. "High King," he said, "you are welcome to me." And the High King raised him and kissed him on both cheeks as a High King should. Then he led him to the eldest of the queens, but even she was not old, and there were no gray hairs on her head and no wrinkles on her cheek, and said, "Sir, this is that Lady Polly who came into Narnia on the first day, when Aslan made the trees grow and the beasts talk." He brought him next to a man whose golden beard flowed over his breast and whose face was full of wisdom. "This is my brother, King Edmund, and this is my sister, the Queen Lucy." "Sir," said Tirian, when he had greeted all these, "if I have read the Chronicles aright, there should be another. Has not your Majesty two sisters? Where is Queen Susan?" "My sister Susan," answered Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." "Yes," said Eustace, "and whenever you've tried to get her to come and talk about Narnia or do anything about Narnia, she says, 'What wonderful memories do you have? Fancy you still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children.'" "Oh, Susan," said Jill, "she's interested in nothing nowadays except nylons and lipstick and invitations. She always was a jolly sight too keen on being grown up." "Grown up indeed," said the Lady Polly. "I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time of one's life as quick as she can, and then stop there as long as she can." "Well, don't let's talk about that now," said Peter. "Look, here are lovely fruit trees. Let us taste them." And then, for the first time, Tirian looked about him and realized how very queer this adventure was. And that is the end of Chapter 12.